Let me first welcome also our two discussants today. I especially would like to welcome our first student discussant during this semester, which is Felix Gerstmeister, who will be, as I said, the first discussant in this series, and thank you very much for volunteering. And our second and you could say external discussant today is Dr. Maximilian Heimstädt, who is an organizational researcher with the Weizenbaum Institut and who received his doctorate from the Institute of Management at the Freie Universität Berlin. Before joining the Weizenbaum Institut, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Reinhart Institute for Management at the University of Wittenberg. In his research, he is interested in openness as a practice and design principle of organizations. And in his dissertation project, he investigated the cooperation of civil society and public authorities in the implementation of open data strategies. In a follow-up project, he accompanied the efforts of the city of New York to make algorithmic decision systems transparent and comprehensible. At the Weizenbaum Institute, he is researching new forms of work and organization in science, often referred to, as is here, as open science. Welcome and thank you very much for participating today and acting as a discussant to the talk from Flamino. So before we start his lecture, I'm happy to introduce today's guest speaker, Flamino Squazzoni. He is a full professor of sociology at the Department of Social and Political Sciences of the University of Milan and director of the Behave, I think that's what it's called, right? A new center for research and training on behavioral sociology of the Department of Social and Political Sciences, the University of Milan. He teaches sociology to undergrad students, behavioral sociology to master students, and behavioral game theory to PhD students. He has been until recently an associate professor of economic sociology at the Department of Economics and Management, the University of Brescia. His fields of research are behavioral sociology, economic sociology, and sociology of science, with a particular interest on the effect of social norms and institutions on cooperation in decentralized, large-scale social systems, as science is one. His research has a methodological focus, which lies in the intersection of experimental and computational research. And for today's topic, it's probably very interesting that from 2014 to 2018, and I think some of it is still ongoing, he has chaired the large-scale EU project PERE, New Frontiers of Peer Review, which was a cost action, which was instrumental to the establishment of an interdisciplinary, intersectoral community of about 160 experts in peer review, including relevant publishers involved in a new effort of internal data sharing, which is something we probably will be talking about today as well. And what is also very fitting to today's topic of Flamino's presentation is that he's very active around editorial work. He has quite a number of editorial activities that he does. I'm just going to mention a few. He is editor of the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulation and co-editor of Sociologica, International Journal for Sociological Debate, and member of a number of editorial boards. So he knows the work of journals and the way peer review works from the inside and from the outside as well. So thank you for agreeing to give this talk, and a warm welcome to you, Flamino, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much for this introduction. I don't know if I fully deserve this, your kind words. I'd like first of all to thank Fabian and Maximilian for discussing my presentation. It's always an honor, a pleasure to have people like you commenting and discussing. And so I hope that this will be a conversation on open peer review, and I will I will make my point clear here in my understanding of pros and cons of open peer review, but I'm very open to learn from others, especially you guys, from other perspective. And so let me just first of all share a little bit of the slides that can help to structure my my point. I hope that, yep, you can see it very well. Thank you. So pros and cons of open peer review. As Martin has said in his kind introduction, today I will speak on both sides, on the side of a journal editor and someone who handles peer review for a journal or two journals at least, and but I will also speak as a scholar who tried to study peer review with data and with modeling. So that's my double role today here. And I would like also to disclaim that that there's a big elephant in my mind's room, which is that I am a sociologist, and this is clear. And as a sociologist, my background has probably influenced quite extensively my understanding and my perspective and my analysis on peer review. And so also today I will, either consciously or not, bring on the table my background. And so this is something that you have to know, and which is obviously just an angle, just a perspective, the one of a sociologist. And this is why I'm quite interested about this idea of conflicts of values, or understanding peer review in a multidimensional scale in terms of values, and complicating at least a little bit the current discussions about open peer review. That's my point. So let me also make another statement, which is at least to be honest about what I consider. So as Martin has said, I have led a quite large European project on peer review, and especially concentrating on peer reviewed journals, and by creating conditions for making possible to share internal journal data for research. And one of the points is which I will talk a little bit just peripherally today, because my focus will be on open peer review. And but my understanding since from the beginning, when I came to develop an interest on peer review, is that peer review is very well debated. So it has very bad name, you know. It's really a point of interest, a point of attraction of a lot of academic frustration. So so there are a lot of people speaking about peer review. There's a lot of anecdotal commentaries and a lot of discussions also in top journals about peer review. Peer review is dead, is a dead end, it's inefficient, is non-sustainable. And there's a lot of ideological, opinions about the dialogue, and the conversation of peer review has been for many years mainly ideological, also because we didn't have data to study systematically and empirically. And so what else to do if not sharing personal experiences and discussing about the state of the art without any systematic overview or chances to have data to measure something relevant in peer review. So my understanding is that there's a lot of obsession about peer review, and this obsession, in my understanding, has been instrumental also to support innovations or create conditions for claiming or for arguing that the innovations were needed to try to solve a peer review problem. And this is, in my opinion, another things that I learned in studying peer review quite for a long time in last years, is that this kind of peer review is not isolated from the context, is not a process that happens in an institutional social vacuum. And so peer review reflects profoundly what happens in academic science. So for instance, my guess is that this kind of frustration about peer review is also due to the hyper competition that now dominates our academic landscape. And so no one loves to be rejected. There's a lot of urban legends about reviewer number two. And scientists are, kind of typically sometimes failing, including myself, in the overconfidence bias, in which we believe that our research is perfect, that it deserves a slot in nature and science. And so we are not very good at receiving a rejection notification after having worked for quite a long time on our own research, and we tend to, probably again believe that our research is relevant because we are doing it. And so this is the idea that I would like also to clarify. I would like what I've tried to do it in this last years, for what I could, but try to put into the debate more data, more evidence, more kind of systematic analysis, and removing a little bit this kind of ideological discussion. So that's the point. Anyway, if you are interested to learn a little bit more about the effort that but just a lot of people made in the post-action Theory, you see here the link to the peer website, which is still alive, although the action expired at the end of 2018. So you can see a lot of examples of research or discussions and materials that we share in these years about trying to make people working together more systematically to try to understand peer review better and avoiding ideological rhetorical analysis. Anyway, so, and another point I would like to make, I found this very brilliant paper by a young American sociologist, Barry Merriman, which was published in the American Sociologist in 2020, in which this scholar has reconstructed the debate about peer review at the American Sociological Association journals, studying the archives and notes and documents and materials that were archived with a very large time span. And I found this paper very brilliant because it captures the obsession of sociologists like me about confidentiality and the double-blind peer review, which is, as you know, mantra among social scientists and people from the humanities. But we on the frontier of this kind of a concept of peer review as a confidential process, as a confidential scrutiny of manuscript by experts in a safe, anonymous context, in which identities are removed, and journals create a closed context in which people can judge each other without being influenced by identity or academic status and others. Sociologists were really leading this kind of concept, and some of the peer review evolution is based on practices, and typically peer review reflects, and its evolution reflects, for instance, even only the challenge to how to handle an increasing number of manuscripts, but together with this kind of practices in my field in sociology, there is also not something that is practiced, but it's something that is written in stone, which are the social norms on which this kind of system has developed. And this paper by this young scholar reconstructs the differences between value norms on one hand and practices on the other. Practices changed over time depending on the context, the challenge of journals, the increasing size of the scientific community, the transformation of the technology, introduction of new technologies, and so the new technological opportunities and the public pressure, for instance, in this phase for transparency, accountability, and then a kernel, which are the social norms in which confidentiality has always been very instrumental for peer review in my field, and it was instrumental for the transformation of peer review from what is called the board-centered model, in which board members and editors were doing most of the job about deciding whether or not to publish a manuscript, to the author-focused and developmental model of peer review, which has been dominant in social sciences in decades now, and in which peer review is not only a quality screening mechanisms to determine what is worth to be published or what is worth reaching public visibility and what is not, but it has been also an institution and a process to try to create value back to the authors, also testifying, also needing, obviously, the value. It's something that is time consuming, and there's also this explain why, for instance, in a social science and in sociology, my field is quite clear that the time the length of the peer review process is dramatically longer than, for instance, in other kind of fields, because the peer review in sociology and the social science is author-focused, is oriented to increase value, it's not just quality screening. And in that kind of case, double blind peer review has always been a decision, a deliberate decision, based typically also on the big influence that Robert Merton's famous father of sociology of science has made in the whole kind of thing. So to see the peer review as inside a multidimensional value, space of values, as an instrument to try to embody the most important values that for Merton were, for instance, I mean, this is interestedness, the community, the expert scrutiny in a safe condition. So this explains why for people like me, double-blind confidentiality is really something very instrumental to the social equality, to give everyone a possibility to be evaluated by experts independent, regardless of the named identity and the academic affiliation of the author. Obviously, the cost has been increasing time and increasing effort by the editorial team and by reviewers, which is another, probably efficiency is another kind of very tension in a current debate. Anyway, so what is the problem I would like to focus here about this kind of confidentiality versus transparency issue in peer review? I see that there are two big schools, and my suggestion is that there are these two inspirational figures in this field. One is Vitek Trax, that many of you probably know has been one of the pioneers of many different kind of innovations in science, and especially in journal publishing. And his position was that peer review and confidentiality is a religious ritual that provides competitive advantage to reviewers against authors. And so it's like a peer review is like a corrupted gatekeeping. So it gives advantages of reviewers who can keep the manuscript of potential competitors on their desk and delaying it or learning from it and try to win the competition for the priority by exploiting this position. And so anonymity is exactly something that creates this kind of, and create information asymmetry between all the figures involved. And at some point, this is why for many, transparency is the only way to try to eliminate this kind of gatekeeping capital of the reviewers. On the other hand, you have another kind of accounts, which is exactly the one which has been dominant in my field, which is the Robert Merton's vision of peer review and confidentiality as a way to ensure the most important elements of science, which is the discovery of the truth, and ensuring a fair treatment to everyone independent of his or her condition. And so anonymity is not something that creates competitive advantages. No, anonymity is key to protect scientists against the risk, which is inherent in the academic community, which is a mix of cooperation, but also competition. Scientists compete for being the first in discovering something, for the priority. But, I mean, it's a way to protect because in a way, it provides a condition in which expert scrutiny can be really oriented toward the truth and removing the possible retaliation that reviewers could have in case they will be spotted by the authors. And that's why, again, double-blind peer review is a mantra, is a pillar of peer review among social scientists. And on the other end, this kind of confidentiality gives also a little bit of stake to editors. So on the one hand, it decentralizes the decision-making and the responsibility about decision, what is valuable, what is worth, what is scientific, what is a knowledge advancement. But on the other end, it still keeps a little bit of stake in the decision at the end of the editor. So it keeps editorial autonomy. So these two visions are obviously probably, no one of these visions is 100% truth or is not 0-1, 1-0. But they capture these two visions, two different kind of positions that also now today we have about the judgment about the situation of peer review. And obviously, if you start from the idea that peer review is a kind of corrupted gatekeeping, it distorts the equality in science, and probably those who believe in this are supporting obviously and viewing transparency as a way to try to solve the problem. And if you consider peer review from the Robert Merton's angle, transparency can undermine the conditions in which a civilized dialogue between experts can happen without, retaliations and this kind of influence of author's prestige. So I think that this kind of two perspectives are still around in our debate, and probably it's good to talk a little bit about these kind of two things. And indeed, whenever a supporter of open peer review and discusses or propose about the expected benefits of open peer review, it's exactly that. The expected benefit is in the idea to remove the position of gatekeeping of the reviewer. So the expectation, this is, for instance, just a snapshot of the original discussions about the benefit of open peer review. Among the benefits, those ones supporting open peer review were including the fact that by making the process more transparent, reviewers were nudged to be more civilized, nudged to be more constructive, avoiding to exploit their kind of position. So the idea was exactly to try to nudge, and reduce the position of power of reviewers, which has been seen as negative in a way, Okay, so obviously everyone is inspired by good ideals and good values is not that, but values are diverse, are heterogeneous, and as every moral philosopher could teach us, typically it's very difficult to maximize one value without creating consequences on another. So typically value judgment are typically trade-off, in which you have to decide a multiple dimension of value, which is the one or the combination of values that one has to, or one wants to maximize, knowing that it's impossible to create an optimal condition in which all the values are probably maximized. And so transparency and confidentiality, in my understanding, are two values with a lot of tension and trade-offs. Okay, so, and this also holds for the concept of peers, which is another interesting angles on which, so who are the peers? Who is the peers? How much this concept is probably triggers this idea of equality, a community of peers on the same level, an horizontal community of peers, whereas we know very well that the academic community is not among peers, but it's basically a hierarchical system in which prestige, reputation are unequally distributed, and typically with strong status hierarchies, which are probably in many cases hidden, not specified. But today, I just put this kind of H-index t-shirt. Today, the problem with the H-index is that it is viewed as a metric which basically proxies the distribution of hierarchical status in a company, in academic community. So again, there's a lot of, in my understanding, problem about the fact that peer review can't be isolated from the academic context. And the academic context is very dense of norms and complexity, and it can't be seen as a word, an horizontal flat word of peers who typically are on the same level of prestige, reputation, and power. So again, any reform and any discussions about peer review without considering this implications about the hierarchies and the competition in science is, in my understanding, a little bit naive. So what is the problem here with this kind of discussion? So the problem is that it's very hard to measure this aspect, this factor. And this is what we have tried to do with this kind of peer initiative, in which we try to pull together a little bit of data from publishers and make it available for research and scrutiny, which is a form of transparency, by the way, not direct, but very, very important in my understanding. And I will discuss this at the end about the different possible ways through which transparency can be added to the process without compromising its kind of foundations. And I give an example here about the application of this protocol for data sharing that we have used to study open peer review with a bunch of Elsevier journals, which shift together at the same time from confidential peer review closed to open peer review at the same time. And we put together data from these 5 journals, and with a time windows 5 years before the shift towards open peer review and 5 years after that. So if I remember well, not 5 years before and 3 years later, I don't remember that. Anyway, so there was about 10,000 submissions to these journals, and we collected about 18,000 reports. So we got full data about manuscript submission from, if I remember well, was editorial manager, I don't know which kind of system, which is another problem, by the way, that is quite, that's every time you work with study peer review, you have to, to try to repropose data that typically are generated from systems which are not designed for research, but designed to handling manuscripts, and it's always a mess. This is what I've learned, but anyway, this is another soul-searching stuff. But just to tell you that our hypothesis was to try to measure what was the input of shifting to open peer review in those journals in which, for shifting to open peer review, you know, this is an umbrella terms where there's a lot of things as Tony Rosselauer has teach us, but in this case where referees were deciding whether or not to agree to have their name and their identity revealed together with a report, which was published, included with a manuscript in case of acceptance. So, and this was a kind of quasi-natural experiments in which we could test the input of a transition. So you see here, this paper has been published a couple of years ago in Nature Communications, and it's open access, so you can check it if you're interested. But so we've tested the what was the input on the willingness of reviewers to review, on the time taken to send back the report, and on the type of recommendations that they were suggesting to the editors. And you see here that whenever reviewers agree to have their name on the signing the report, were the case in which their recommendation were more positive. Whereas when the recommendation were negative, they did not wanted to have their name on the report. And in general, there has been an effect of this transition from pre-closed review to open peer review, in which the distribution of recommendation were slightly more positive under open peer review than before. More importantly, the ones who were more affected in terms of more sensitive behavior was more sensitive towards this kind of manipulation and transition, where especially young scientists, young scholars who were more preferably to review and were also more positive in their kind of recommendations. We didn't find any gender differences between women and men in terms of willingness to review or time taken to review or type of recommendations, by the way. But what we found was that by studying the linguistic, the text of the report, we did not find, this was another hypothesis, that open peer review will have bring or induced reviewers to write their reports differently, more civilized, in more positive way, in less emotional kind of tests. We didn't find big changes in terms of the linguistic style of writing reports when these 5 journals shifted to open peer review. And so it seemed that, I mean, we didn't find a lot of, dramatic effect. The only thing that we found was this one, that only 8.1% of reviewers agreed on signing their published reports, and only when they were recommending to publish the paper or only recommended minor revision. This is regardless of gender, seniority, and disciplines. And so we were considering why only 8.1% of reports included names. What is the problem? Why people were not keen to have their names on the, and when and why they were revealing their identity only where they were, supportive to the author's manuscripts. What does this, behaviorally speaking, what this can reveal? And so we started from this puzzle, and obviously, I mean, it was very difficult for us to study what could be the implications. So one of the hypotheses was, I suppose, the hypothesis that open peer review transforms the process into a signaling game. in which by knowing the identity of each other and assuming that others will know your identity, you start to send signals to other scholars in terms of cooperation, in terms of collusion. I help you getting published, expecting that you will help me back in the future. So some reciprocity kind of motivation, which could be probably detrimental, obviously, to the quality of the process. But how can we test that? Very difficult. So this is why we got this idea to use agent-based modeling, computer simulation, to create a very simplistic artificial settings, try to capture some abstract essential elements of peer review, but without pretending to create any kind of realistic simulation of what really happens in peer review. So we just wanted to concentrate on and so we created very abstract agent-based modeling in which we simulated a population of scientists and who were casted for each time tick. So the simulation means that you simulate a dynamic. So you program your agents to behave, to execute some rules, and then you have this kind of simulation which allows you to see what happens over time or over space, in that case over time with our media. So every time in our simulation where every agents in a population were selected to play as either authors or referee. In case they were casted to play the role of authors, they had to submit a manuscript. In case they were casted to play the role of reviewers, they were assigned a manuscript to review. And they got some resources to do that. So they need resources to submit manuscripts, resources to write down reports. And these kind of resources were unequally distributed for each time tick to all the agents. It was a minimal amount of resources to do their job, like university or access to online resources or to libraries or to an office. But then they could accumulate or lose resources depending on the fact they were published or not as authors. So they could accumulate or lose resources depending on the publication. And they got an expected quality. So resources were a proxy of status, reputation, capacities, capabilities. And so the higher resources, higher probability to write a high quality paper. Lower resources, higher probability to submit a low quality manuscript. We had this kind of normal deviation so that even people very rich with a lot of resources could sometimes write down a very not very high quality paper, and sometimes lucky those on having few resources got a brilliant idea and could write a very brilliant manuscript. But this is the idea. And this kind of resources, this kind of quality was a quality as authors and the quality as referees. And so what was the idea? The idea was that authors were submitting manuscripts which were expressing the expected quality, and they were matched with a referee. The referee got his or her expected quality. And in case this kind of quality in terms of resources were distant, this makes more hard for reviewers to understand the paper of the authors. So the closer the idea of resources between authors and referees, and the high probability that they could understand each other, and referees can also spend less time and try to, scrutinize the paper and say, okay, the paper is worthy. It's a very nice paper, take it, or no, it's a low quality paper, reject it. And whereas referees got to spend more time and so more resources to discover the value of the manuscript of a very prestigious scientist. Let's suppose a PhD, let's suppose our Fabian, his first review report, and he has to review the paper of a Nobel Prize or a very prestigious scholar in his field. Well, he will have to spend a lot of time in trying to read the manuscript and understanding all the complexity of the research and the methodology. So this is the question. So this is the hypothesis. So there were manuscripts got intrinsic quality, which were a proxy of the expected quality and resources of authors. But referees got to discover that kind of intrinsic quality, and they could do their best to try to discover it. And so that if they were investing what they had to invest, and they were more or less approximating with a little bit of noise the real value of the manuscript. And so they were assigning to the manuscript the real value. So a numerical value very close to the intrinsic quality of the manuscript. In case they were saving a little money because they didn't want to, really provide a pertinent judgment, and so these are the part of the behavioral manipulation that I am going to introduce you in a minute. They were saving money, and they were just, writing down a number, a numerical value, which were very far or higher or lower than the true quality of the manuscript. And then decisions about the publication were made upon those kind of evaluation of reference, not based upon the true quality of the manuscript. And then within a similar journals or editors, there was a selection mechanism in which there was a matching between one author and one referee, very brutal simplification. And at some point, among all the list of manuscripts, depending on the rating, so the assessment of the reviewers, we decided to have a publication selection rate, like publishing 25% of the all manuscript and rejecting 75%. But this is a parameter, so you can remove this parameter, making the competition stronger, so publishing only 10%, or making the competition less strong and publish 50% or whatever you want in the model. But this to simulate a little bit of competition, and so people could lose really resources in case they were probably worth a publication, but referees were lazy and they just didn't do the proper job, and so they got rejected and they lose all the resources invested. So if published, if there was a multiplier giving more resources to people to publish with others, if not published, they were losing all these kind of resources invested. It was a draconian kind of, obviously it's completely unrealistic, but this is not the point, this was not the idea of the model. Anyway, so we ran the simulation, but by testing two scenarios, one in which, as if the dominant model of peer review were confidential peer review. So no one, authors and referees were randomly casted, they would do their job, and then they forgot everything, so they could not spot the identity of the other scientist. So we assume, for instance, we initialized the simulation with three behavioral assumptions. One, that referees were all fair. They tried to do their job. They invest all the resources to try to discover the true quality of the author's manuscript. Second scenario, no, referees were unreliable. They were just trying to save money, just randomly providing judgment, and they keep money for them for getting the high possibility to have a high quality manuscript when they were casted to play as authors. And then we add a little bit of adaptation, or adaptation of response. So scientists were strategically reciprocating. If they were published in the previous round, they were reliable as referees to reciprocate back the help of pertinent judgment of referees later. But if they were rejected, they were reacting by being unreliable, by disinvesting as referees and just providing a very random kind of evaluation to the editors, so to keep their resources for trying to get published. So we try to add a little bit of adaptation in terms of the strategy. So obviously they were adapting and reciprocating in their experience as authors and referees, but without knowing with whom they were reciprocating, because peer review was confidential. And so they didn't know the names or the identity of the other referees or the other authors. So they were just reciprocating and adapting to what happens without targeting specific individuals. Then we run a scenario in which, let's assume that instead of being confidential, peer review is open. And let's assume that this is mandatory. So it's open peer review. There's no way to opt-in out, opt-in in. It's no way, it's a draconian. The king has decided, no way to discuss it. And so let's suppose that scientists are sensitive to this kind of their previous experience. So they are satisfied or not, and they react upon the satisfaction to get published or to get rejected later. But let's suppose that now identities are revealed. So now they can see that Flamino was the referee so Flamino is the referee of Maximilian's paper, and Flamino has suggested the editor to reject Maximilian's paper. And so Maximilian got rejected and he lost all the resources invested. Let's suppose that Maximilian have a list in his mind and said, Flamino, bad. And let's suppose that he is matched with Merton later, and Merton was positive, and so Maximilian got accepted for publication. Okay, Flamino bad, Merton good. And so let's see that people keep this kind of mental account about each other. And so let's suppose that Maximilian is casted next to review the Flamino's paper, and he remembers about Flamino suggesting to reject his paper. And so this means that Maximilian will be extremely hard on Flamino's paper, and he will do his best to try to destroy Flamino's paper, write down a report that induces the editor to reject Flamino. And let's suppose that later Maximilian is matched with Martin, and he remembers Martin was positive. And then in that case, Maximilian will be more positive and will try to help Martin getting published. So let's suppose that there is this kind of things, which is what in game theory is a little bit the difference between indirect reciprocity, in which we are sensitive to what happens to us, but our behavior is not targeted to specific individuals, to a dyadic interaction in which, no, we start to play a cooperation game with each other, like in dyadic interaction. Well, and then we also make another assumption in other scenarios. Now, Flamino, Maximilian, and Martin are all our peers, are all the same. There's no differences. Flamino is not high prestigious scientist, and so on. Okay, very well. But let's suppose that Maximilian now can not only remember Flamino's and Martin's work as a referee, but Maximilian now is able to compare himself, his resources, his capability, and his prestige with the one of Flamino and Martin. And let's suppose that Maximilian, I don't want to offend you, well, let's suppose that Maximilian is high status, has more resources, more prestigious position than Flamino. In that case, even if Flamino has recommended, what else? Maximilian is higher, and so he is not, no fear or retaliation from Flamino, and so Maximilian is doing his job without considering Flamino's retaliation. Let's suppose that instead Martin is more prestigious than Maximilian. In that case, Maximilian, even if Martin has recommended rejecting his paper before, but Martin is very strong guy. It's better not to, it's better not to be bad with him. Otherwise, I can be retaliated. So let's suppose that again, Maximilian now can compare himself with the others and decide to be fair, especially those one who are more prestigious than him, and be harsh with others who are less prestigious than him. So whenever identities are revealed, these kind of games, obviously it's just, an hypothetical scenarios. This is not realistic enough, but anyway, just to make a case, And you see that the model, that the paper is still under review, but the model is now available on the ComSes. So if you want to go and play with the model, you can do it with this kind of link. Okay, so what happens? Let's suppose that we run this model in all these kind of scenarios, and we measure at the end of each time, which is a fictitious kind of element. Time is not days, years, or months. It's just a simulation tick in which all these kind of rules are executed by all our agents. In our case, if I remember, the N of the population is something like 200 scientists, if I remember, or 2,000. Don't remember that. It's irrelevant. It's scale-free, so it's irrelevant. But let's suppose that here you see for each time tick, the differences between the ideal list of public of 25% of a better paper that should have been published if only manuscripts were judged upon their intrinsic value and quality, compared to the current list as determined by referee's opinion. So bias means that it measures the differences between these two, the ideal ranking and the real ranking. And here you see that obviously when reviewers under confidentiality are fair, obviously the bias is minimized. And the bias is just typically the noise functions that we added in the model to make a little bit impossible for referees to exactly, estimate precisely, numerically, the quality of the manuscript. And so it's just a little bit of noise, but it's something like 80%, something like that. It's almost perfect with fair. But with unreliable, which is a random stuff, obviously, which is the blue here, with unreliable under the confidentiality, under confidential peer review, typically something like half and half. So it means that half of the times a nice manuscript deserving to be published were not published. You see here that whenever referees were sensitive to their previous experience as authors and were reacting positively or negatively depending on their success or their unlucky, this situation of the bias approximates exactly the random situation, is this one. So if referees are sensitive to reciprocity, I mean, it's really random. It's like a random situation. And look here, the confidential peer review against the open peer review, in which scientists are sensitive, as in the confidential, but start to play these kind of games like, Flamino and Martin and Maximilian, I told you later. In that case, the bias in the publication dramatically increased compared to the confidential peer review. And the more time goes on and people start to play this kind of equilibrium strategy, and the more the publication bias increase. And by the way, I'm sorry, getting close to the end. So, and we also distorted. In that case, I mean, Maximilian was able to compare himself with Flamino and Martin, try to, as if there were the H index, there was an objective kind of function. And so, I mean, everyone could easily compare to each other, and as if there were, H index mantra, everything was public, no bias in terms of estimating each other position in the system. But let's suppose that there's a bias. Let's suppose that Maximilian was biased in a way that, okay, Flamino is lower than me in terms of prestige, but he's a sociologist like me. And I love to be fair with sociologists. So let's suppose that Martin is higher than me, but is not a sociologist, he's a computer scientist, and I don't want to be fair with computer science. So let's suppose this, or let's suppose that Flamino is lower than me, but Maximilian knows that Flamino is hiring and Maximilian is interested in a position in the Flamino's group. Whatever noise function which does not lead Maximilian to predict exactly Flamino's and Martin's position, as if there were a bias in terms of belongings, community, discipline, methodology, whatever. And we run this kind of thing in which status was disentangled from productivity and was distorted by belongings or these kind of things. See that there's no much difference in case status is a proxy of productivity, which could also be a case in which people could say, okay, there's a, peers are distributed unequally, there's a hierarchy, there are more brilliant people, less brilliant people, there are people smarter, people less smart, and so we pay deference to this kind of smartness, or the fact that people are more intelligent or invest more in research than what we do. But in case this is not the case, but status is just distorted, the difference is minimal. So it's, in any case, that distortion is quite high compared to the confidential peer review. Look here, for instance, this is the average publication quality you see here in the confidential versus open when scientists are sensitive to reciprocity or sensitive to are overreacting or adapting according to their own kind of experience. So it's like if every time people are casted to review a manuscript, it's not like they did not forget, they remember what happened before. You know that in, for instance, the game theory, there's this idea of whenever you play the same game in a sequence, although the situation is different, although you're playing with another opponent, as if there were a sequence of one-shot games where you play with others, and so you have to decide what to do, best for you, but who cares about what happens yesterday? There are consistent evidence about behavioral science in which even when we know that for our optimal strategy, it would be better to conceive a sequence of decisions with other opponents as a sequence of one-shot games in which we just forget what happens yesterday, because as you are playing like, random thing, we are matching with someone else. We humans are not, they don't do that. Humans are being trained by evolution to see coherence between their experience. And so it's impossible that we forget what happened yesterday, even if we play with someone else. And so this is a quite consistent findings about that. So let's suppose that scientists fail in the same kind of cognitive traps or of remembering what happens in the past and reacting against this kind of experience, even if they don't know whom they are playing with. Anyway, So you see here that the average quality of manuscript is obviously higher under confidential peer review when all the reviewers are fair. Obviously is, as I told you, the quality between the reciprocity scientists and the unreliable referee who were just randomly selling their opinion to editors is very similar. But all the scenarios in which we run the open peer review, the average quality of published paper was lower. And obviously, given that under open peer review, people were trying to do their best to convince the editors, because the reports were going to be public, they were investing in more in their report. So there's lower quality and higher cost, which is exactly what not probably a perfect designer will build a system upon. Anyway, so this is just a game, I don't pretend that it's just to what could happen if, we can assume that the system is running in certain ways. It's just a case, just a provocation for debate. There's no data that we can calibrate this model, at least not yet. So it's just to make a case. But just to give you how much, the peer review outcome is sensitive to the response of scientists, to the variation in terms of behavioral strategies of scientists. And we know very well that, again, scientists are sensitive to the context. And obviously, for instance, the more competitive is the landscape, the more probably rewards are for submitting high quality manuscript rather than submitting high quality reports to journals. And what about, this is the case, what about if transparency is very important, is today required by policymakers, by stakeholders in general, and it's a trend which is very important to know, and there's a lot of advantages about transparency in terms of peer review. But what if scientists were sensitive to this kind of status? What if this kind of 88.1% of referees who did not sign their reports under the Elsevier trial on open peer review were just influenced by the fact that they didn't want to signal themselves as someone who rejected another manuscript, or were more willing to reveal themselves when they were helpful for another author? So, and what if we at some point decide by a king law that everything is open, everything is really transparent, but really something draconian? What can happen to the mechanics of the science system in which, people are in positions, they are sensitive to each other's prestige, they young people, young PhD students, maybe the next year's is Fabian, who is maybe, we're not better not to reject Flamino, otherwise, I kill myself and Flamino can retaliate and making me, outside the community, or, so what if, now this is the point. And is transparency the only value that we want to maximize? Or in that case, in this idealistic scenario, if we assume the scientists are behaving in that kind of way, are sensitive to this kind of experience, and are pushed by the academic rewards to compete like beasts to get the publishing top journals, to get more resources, more prestige, more funds, more reputation, and have more offsprings, more groups, and increasing their kind of influence, what can happen is that probably transparency can interact with another value, which is the independence of judgment, which is the truth, the tensions for the truth. And so, this is something that probably is something that needs to be discussed in a way. There's no only one value, and so on. And what if what if this kind of conflicts of value could tell us a little bit about the misalignment between the open science agenda, which everyone endorses, including myself, and is not compatible, I don't tell against nature, but it's really misaligned with the fundamental institutions, norms, and rewards, which have developed together with the science system. What if this, do we need to discuss this kind of, can we achieve this kind of transparency without, so the objective of making the process more transparent with all the value, including training reviewers on real reports and this kind of stuff, which everyone agrees on, what about if we will achieve this kind of transparency goal without open peer review? Well, this is what I try to do myself, but unfortunately not successful enough. Is that let's suppose to have data to study peer review and what happened in peer review, to have data on reports, to study really, to try to understand maybe, again, if referees are this kind of gatekeeper who are exploiting their position or not, by assessing data. Let's create an infrastructure sharing data on internal journal. This is a form of transparency without touching the core of the model of the peer review. So anyway, the best thing is that I prefer beer to peer review, and drink a beer with the editor is always a very good, nice move. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that I've probably run out of time a little bit. And I'm more than happy to know what Maximilian and Fabian think about this kind of talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Flamino. Although the idea of having a beer with you is very enticing right at the moment, but the problem is still we cannot travel. We would very much like to. We very much would have liked to invite you here to Berlin to have a beer with you. So thank you much for this very lively talk, and I guess also a discussion-inspiring talk. I hope at least. I'm just here to hand over to Maximilian and Fabian. I don't know how they puzzled this out, how they're going to start, but I just hand over to you and you do your thing, whatever that is right now.
Thanks so much, Martin and Flamino. Yeah, indeed, we had a short pre-briefing or meeting in which we discussed what you will most likely tell us, Flamino, and I think your talk included some of these aspects, but also a lot of new arguments and new fascinating findings. And so I would ask Fabian if he would like to start maybe with some of his points or with questions or remarks from the community, if he wants. So otherwise, also I see him nodding. So and I think we just maybe take turns here and see how it evolves.
Yeah, first, thank you for your talk. It was really inspiring. And I want to start because you started like with the gold standard, double blindness peer review. And what I find like in recent years with the oncoming of preprints, if there's actually, or do you think how this changed double blindness when reviewers can just take the title, put it in Google Scholar, and they'll probably know in 0.1 second who the actual author is. So there's like a discrepancy, and journalists say, yeah, we are double blind, but is there really double blind anymore?
Yes, very good question, Fabian. Very smart questions. Yeah, of course. Technologies and infrastructure today make and again the attractiveness of preprints make the author's identity easy to spot. However, think about the fact that this is the question is not only about the fact that reviewers should not be influenced by the identity of the authors. Is also the fact that if there's that they could claim that they did not know. So the double blind makes reviewers can know that this is Maximilian can know that this is Flamino's paper. But if he is reviewing under double blind, he can at least say, Flamino, I didn't know you were you. This paper was yours. So it's a way of creating at least a context in which at least reviewers could claim that they were, not knowing the other. So I know that it's a little bit of probably a trick which is difficult. But obviously, yes, this is the double blind is challenged, obviously, but it's minded is not only from the other side, it's most important from the reviewer side.
Okay, should we take turns, Fabian?
And by the way, also Fabian is a very good question in the sense that this also explains why probably social scientists and sociology are not very at the frontier of preprint movement. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I had actually a couple of situations where I put the title of the working paper on my private website, and then the journal contacted me and told me I had to take the title off, otherwise they won't send it out for peer review. I had one methodologic question, sort of, on your first work at the Nature Communications part, which is, so there's a lot of interesting work in organization studies, which looks at organizations that claim or that pledge to be super transparent or radically transparent. And these studies usually find that it's not that there's like the front stage, backstage division that's resolved, but it just shifts somewhere else. So the organizations appear to be, they online stream all their meetings and they publish all their reports, but they just set up new backstages, so to say. And the promise of your first study, if I understood this experiment correctly, is you wanted to figure out, okay, for example, Elsevier wanted to figure out if the tone becomes more friendly or more aggressive. And my gut feeling would be that sort of course, the reports might be nice, but what about this field comments to the editors? And if you looked at this as well, so I would assume that all the anger and ranting moves into this field, maybe. So my question is, does it go away, or maybe shift?
Very good point. Very good point, Maximilian. That's another very important point about this. Also tells you how much important are the function of editors to screening. We have obviously, yes, could be that the reports, but the data from the reports came from the real reports submitted from the reviewers before the cleaning of the. But sure, and we have run another analysis of the review reports in another paper published later in eLife last year, in which we were just trying to understand the use of the tone, and especially also the moral dimensions and how values were used by reviewers. And we did not find a lot of variations in. It seems to me that reports are very standardized. So now, I mean, referees are following standards, and for instance, we are running now with the Elsevier and others with the Theorie an analysis about the unprofessional comments by reviewers by scanning the text of many 100,000 reports, and we found a very tiny presence of unprofessional comments on the large. This could be that obviously our data could be biased in a way that these are journals probably with a high prestige impact factor and are run by some also from associations. It could be that probably you can find a little bit more variations on the way the reviewers are doing their job in maybe less or more innovative or less stabilized and with long tradition kind of journals. So still, it's something that we still need more data to try to figure out what is going on. But my question is that we overemphasize this kind of variation. Since that, I mean, my understanding is that I studied gender bias. I studied from different angles, quite large scale data, and not frustration. I'm happy about that. But it seems that we are not finding strong kind of signals of great variations of reviewers' behavior. Since the system is quite stable, that's my impression. The gut feeling more than that. That's the point.
Thank you.
But obviously, I mean, the editors have the job. I'm an editor. It has been very rare that I found unprofessional comments in my journals. But I remember, for instance, some reviewers' misanthropy is extremely harsh, and just okay, got it. I will never ask him or her to review anymore. So that is this kind of things of editors have a very important position to try to clean a little bit the stage.
Thank you, Fabian. I'm sure you have
Then I have another question about the data of the first paper you presented. And did you look mostly at the reviews for accepted papers, because like a large share of papers never got accepted? And as far as I understand, most journals, I think there's like a few exceptions, only publish the reviews of the papers that are accepted. And that means like the largest share of reviews are going to the trash like they're used to. And if you think this should be maybe like changed, and there's problems in publishing reviews for rejected papers, and yeah, but maybe it's also like the positive side outweighs the bad side.
Yeah, that's a very brilliant question, Fabian. Thank you for this question. Yeah, you got a very important point. In the Elsevier dataset, we got all data also from a rejected manuscript. So we got full data. So we could also, understand the some characteristic of the reviewer report or the reviewer independently, regardless of the fact that the manuscript were accepted for publication or not. But you got a very important point in the sense that much research on open peer review is on the top of the iceberg. So I mean, you see what happened when things went well, and so the manuscript was accepted for publication, and the comments and the reports were published together with that. The question is, can we really understand or learn something from a system where we don't have any data about the failures or about the other side? So this is a very good point. So and this is why I sometimes take this kind of findings a little bit cautiously, because it's just scratches just one part, and for learning and for fixing problems, you don't have to look only to when things went well. This is a very good point.
Yeah, especially since the share of published papers to rejected papers is not that big. Also, what I would find interesting in publishing rejections is for young scholars to learn to write rejections, because also it's not always easy to say, it's like, no, I don't think your paper is that good. So you can maybe learn from that, just as a follow-up, as a personal opinion, and then I can give it to Maximilian again.
Yeah, very good point. And well, situation now is better than just 10 years ago. Now we have a lot of repository for peer review data, think about problems and others, in which you can probably independently from the journal data, which always, as I can tell you, it's always a mess getting journal data. It's always problematic, and there are repositories in which young scholars can learn how to review, how to for instance recommend a rejection by using this kind of review reports. You can find in many repositories. Yeah.
There's already one question in the chat, but I have one last sort of methodological question regarding your recent work that's under review. So I found it super fascinating because it's a question I've been thinking about myself as well, but of course only on an anecdotal level, so to say. I was wondering whether you have tried out different timings of revealing the identity, because you kind of simulated the, from my point of view, most extreme variant of open identities, where from the start of the reviewing process, both parties know the identity of the other. But I, for example, also think that revealing the identity of reviewers after the paper has been accepted could also be a version of open identities. And I was wondering if you checked or simulated that as well, and if it would change anything in these the problematic dynamics.
Yeah, this is a very good point, obviously. Yeah. The point is that, so your question is also about the fact that obviously people know each other, so they could spot the identity of reviewers in case of publication. And one could be probably to run scenarios in which only when a paper is published, identities are revealed, whereas if the paper is rejected, identities are not revealed, which could be obviously, which is most of the cases is the idea. So yeah, obviously our model is draconian in a way that it makes extreme scenarios, and in these kind of extremes, obviously these are unrealistic. So there's no probably examples of journals which will follow the type of open peer review that we simulated in our model. So journals typically are doing very intelligent, so they know very well they learn from practice and without how to avoid certain kind of things that can backfire. So it's that. But you know, that what I'm fascinated about this kind of agent-based modeling or this kind of computer simulation is that I'm using them exactly to reproduce extreme scenarios which are impossible to empirically observe. And I do believe that this is in any case an advantage of the tool. Obviously, the problem is that I know very well, and this is probably also what you behind the lines of your question, is that it would be fantastic to calibrate these kind of models on real data in order to try to bring this kind of extreme scenarios and calibrate them in a way that they can tell something relevant for the reality and the context. But again, we are moving in a very suboptimal, and I'm just elegant to say it, suboptimal situation with the peer review study. So we don't have an infrastructure for sharing data. We just whenever a group of people studying peer review and some group of journals, they spend months on cleaning data from the manuscript submission system. It's completely crazy, and so it's very difficult to really. I would love at some point to have this kind of fusion of modeling, which you can inform models informed by data, in which you can project future kind of scenarios. Say what can happen if the situation is going that direction, or what happen if the pace of journals adopting this type of peer review model increase. What can happen at a larger scale over time? That could be fantastic, but still we're very far from that kind of point, unfortunately. And so I use models just to as a play toy for hypothetical scenarios, and this is just that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think the question from the chat is also more or less directly related to the availability of data. I can read it out in case not everyone can see the chat. So the question is, reviewers seem to be very powerful. To what extent the selection of reviewers is discussed to more transparent and fair review process?
Yeah, Julie, this is a very obviously this is a very important point. I remember when I read this Berman account about the peer review at the American Sociological Association journals, and said that at the end, when the model of peer review shifted to the developmental model, in which reviewers were engaged not only for quality screening but also pretending to sending or expected to send back comments, constructive comments, to help authors improve in their paper for later submissions or whatever. Obviously, this was a very big transition from the editorial peer review, in which the editors were the kings and the queen of everything, to this kind of developmental peer review in which reviewers are more powerful sometimes. Sometimes it's, for instance, for editors, sometimes you got the impression that especially with complex journals, the editors are still fighting to get the strategic vision and to keep the development of the journal, because at some point, at the end of the day, reviewers are deciding most of the cases about the publication. So there's obviously a little bit of problem about that, and the selection obviously is as you said, is really very difficult. It's and Jules, the situation of the editor is so desperate that the problem is not the selection, the problem to ensure at least 2 or 3 reports per manuscript. Situation under COVID, it's crazy for many of us about doing that. However, editors have this stake. If reviewers are unfair, non-pertinent, unprofessional, the editor's job is to clean them out, not inviting them anymore. And obviously the problem is that we don't have a centralized system in which reviewers are certified and their quality is approved, is assessed, and so that journals editors can go in that kind of system and pick up the reviewers who are more reliable and so on. The situation is that each journal has its own kind of referee sample. The question is that if someone misbehaves with the journal as a reviewer, until this information is known by all the editors, it takes so the bad apples now are really damaging the system without being spotted. so there's no way to share. At least there are ways to share it at the level of this branch of journals in the single type of editorial system. But again, there are n number of editorial system, n number of management system, n number of publishers. It's really it's really difficult. That is the idea. The question is that we can punish those journals who are not ensuring high quality peer review by not submitting anymore our manuscript there. Obviously, sometimes it's difficult to do it, especially when then you have to publish on prestigious journals and you don't have a very, but again, we have some choices. That's this kind of mantra about competing like beast for the most prestigious journals and getting crazy if you are not a super H index. It's something that is in our hands. So it's in our mind. Some point you could say, I do my job. I do serious research. I publish in decent journals, and I do my stuff. But obviously, it's difficult. But the quality of peer review, if journal will continue to exist, they will exist to ensure high quality process of peer review to authors. Otherwise, they lose their missions and so on. And in that case, you can punish them by just not submitting anymore there. But the selection of the referee is non-transparent. This is surely you are right.
Oh, yeah.
So I also want to, just because we're discussants, I don't think maybe we should be the only people asking questions. So maybe other people want to turn on the microphone and also ask questions. I just want to say that maybe, oh yeah, Martin wants to ask a question. So he's the first. Maybe we can do it like with the raising hand, so we can also see if you want to talk with us. So Martin, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I raised the hand for one to show that you can raise the hand and ask a question like this. And on the other hand, because I have questions until the end of the day, because it's about peer review and it's something I'm interested and passionate about. So I have two things that I wanted to add. One is sort of a comment about how, or a suggestion about how to think about openness and transparency in not such a radical way as it is usually implied. And then would be sort of two thought experiments for your model, for your agent-based model. So, I mean, the call for openness and the call for transparency usually is a radical political move. It's associated with, historically, with the Enlightenment period and the idea that a system is basically corrupt or biased or something like that. So we usually should see this as a sort of a very strong political signal that some actors within a society have a strong perception of something is not right, or have strong interests that need to be articulated that aren't articulated so far. And what you alluded to with Maximilian did it with the organizational point is that the result that we get from these processes usually is not total openness, right? We get mediated forms of openness that find sort of acceptable working standards, working procedures. And if we look for politics, we can see that in democratic systems, they are never truly completely transparent. They have sort of ways of dealing and organizing processes that work and that satisfy the interests of those that were dissatisfied at the end of the day. The thing that helped me was the work from Pierre Rosanvallon, a political scientist who rephrased openness and transparency as legibility. The idea that processes through which we decide about our common good, processes through which we reach decisions about common goods should be legible. People should be able to understand them. They should have an idea what actually happens. It doesn't have to be always the case that they know exactly what happened, but at least they know in principle what usually happens and what the ideas were, what the norms are, what the processes are that usually produce these results. And I think that's an effective way of sort of shifting the openness goal to a more realistic goal, which could be legibility, which is interesting for science and for peer review especially, because peer review has the interesting characteristic, as you That's why you can do these game models, right? There's reciprocity. So one day I'm the reviewer and the next day I'm the author. And this switches back and forth. And through that, I get to see the system from both sides. You could say from the inside and from the outside. And I get some legibility of the process. I get to understand how it works. I may still be disenchanted from it, but it's sort of a more enlightened way of being disenchanted if I don't like it. So I think legibility is a good way of thinking about openness in other terminology. The two things that came to mind when I thought about your model, sort of one of the things these models do is that you start to think about what is missing, what is not modeled here that should be important or could be important. Two things came to mind because they are sort of pet peeves for me in peer review research. One you already discussed a little bit is the role of editors. So this is not a two-party game. This is at least a three-party game. There's an editor, and usually we think the editor is the one that mediates this situation in a way that he excludes, for instance, extreme behavior or extreme judgments, as you showed. So an interesting aspect would be how would models look if we make this a three-party game and not a two-party game, because the strategies would become very interesting and I think also very realistic in a way that we usually have difficulty thinking about, because you had the example of sort of the misbehaving reviewer who has an extreme judgment and becomes uncivil, right? That could be part of a game with the editor. This could be the reviewer saying, I don't want to review for this journal anymore. This might be very extreme, but that is something that happens every day, right? Part of my reviewer report to a paper is not just to say what I think about the paper, but what are the arguments I want to give the editor to make a decision. So usually I'm playing a game with the editor and the other reviewer maybe, and the author. So that makes these games more complex, and I think that's interesting to think about. And the other maybe less conventional thing is you have the assumption in there that the papers have an inherent quality. And the role of the peer review procedure is to identify this quality. And the fact is, quality is also produced through these procedures. So the papers come out of these decisions with different qualities than they had when they went in there, not just because they got revised, but if an important journal accepts a paper, people will first give it more importance because it's in an important journal. So they will read it differently. From reading it differently, they may interact with the paper more intensely. They may find more valuable stuff within the paper than they would if it was published in a less important journal. So peer review procedures also produce quality. And if they have this performative effect, or I think that would be an easy thing to model in these types of simulations. And I wonder whether you thought about it or whether you have an element in there that I didn't catch that actually captures some of this.
No, very, very well. So we can work together with this paper, by the way. So that's two brilliant ideas that you gave me. Yeah. So yeah, it's relatively easy. It's not dramatically difficult to add to this kind of dyadic interaction, triadic with adding editors. And it's a very good idea in the sense that editors at some point could, for instance, punish bad reviewers by not contacting them anymore, which is exactly what an editor is supposed to do to clean the field. Or as you suggest, that at some point authors or reviewers can say no because they were unsatisfied by the quality of the peer review process they were exposed to, either as authors or reviewers. So that could be something very, very easy, in sense easy, but very relevant to add. So thank you. That's a very good move. And so yeah, and as you said, in our model now, that's initial quality of the manuscript when submitted, and this is the whole point. We could have this kind of initial quality, and then depending on something happening in the process, depending on the quality of the review reports, I mean the final quality of the manuscript, that could be they could increase in case they were exposed to pertinent reviewers, or could even decrease in case they were. I remember a couple of examples of papers in the preprint version, very nice, easy to read. It's like 25 minutes, you got all the point, and published in the top journals in my field, and becoming 65 pages long, unreadable manuscripts after 3 years, something like that. Yeah, that's a very, thank you. These are two very important kind of explorations that is relatively easy to do with these kind of novels, and I will very much willing to cooperate with you guys if you want to collaborate in this kind of next step. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very brilliant kind of comment. Thank you. Very helpful.
So Maria has risen her hand, so if she wants to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I don't have a camera today, but anyway, I hope that is not a problem.
No.
Okay, I got the impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but that there is a clear level of mistrust within the community, especially when we go back to the two schools of open review. Like one mistrusts the author and the retaliation, and maybe corporations and all of that behind the author and so on. And also on the other level, we have this mistrust of the reviewer, how they will proceed if there is some interest behind their review in the first place, and so on. My question would be then, if, first of all, if I'm correct in having this impression, if this level of mistrust is warranted or not, is it natural or not to exist in such a community? And if it is, how are we supposed to try and overcome this, if it is if we are able to overcome this in the first place naturally? And if peer review can challenge said mistrust without feeding to one or the other narrative in the first place?
Oh yeah, very interesting and complex question by the way. Well, you know, one of the things that was also Martin was raising this idea that the transparency of the process and could be also probably giving people more information about what is going on in this is something that is very important to create trust in a sense. Like, my impression is that this gap between what really happens behind the secret rooms of journals and what we know is creating a lot of ambiguity and tensions, and probably does not help especially young scholars to understand what kind of system and how to proper and appropriately develop the kind of growth in a systems. Yeah, that there is this something that could be probably very helpful in. Then again, the question is that I know that probably is a little bit deterministic kind of explanation, and but this is what a sociologist is supposed typically. This is the sociologist perversion about always blaming the context. But anyway, probably it's true. I mean, it's you can. My impression is that you can change whatever model you want of peer review, but the condition of the hyper competition between us at all levels, it's creating a lot of tensions and other problems. Okay, we are personally frustrated to get rejected in our ambition to publish in top journals, and so we are a little bit. We got this idea that those one getting disproportionately published in top journals are, colluding or are not deserving that much attention that they have. But this is the idea that individuals will always be. I mean, we are overconfident. We know very well. We spend years on the research project. We spend years in collecting data. We spend years in developing models to try to discover something. And typically, individually, we pay the cost of these kind of failures and the experimental nature of scientific investigation. And sometimes this is the only problem, really, that individuals, some individuals pay the cost of the risk of the which is at the core of this priority for rewards in science. And you can fix whatever you want and develop one model or another, but this will happen. So science is not democratic. That's the problem. It's a competitive environment, and in which we are competing for getting the first in discovering something new. And unfortunately, there are winners and losers. That's the problem. But anyway, I'm endorsing that we can create more trustful kind of relationship between us if we will follow, like Martin was saying, and provide people more information about what is going on and what they are supposed and expected to do. And this is something that it's still, there's a research about how many journals include clear instructions about peer review or peer review guidelines to reviewers, and sometimes it's frustrating to see it in 2021 still. There's a percentage of journals in which people do not know what is going on. I mean, what type of peer review model the journal adopts, or and which kind of guidelines and support reviewers and authors have to really understand what is going on. It's really something frustrating. I don't believe that we need a revolution. We need to improve the system. That's the whole point. And the situation, unfortunately, is about that scientists will continue to compete. There's no way. That's the life that we have.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is cultural evolution, guys. I mean, societies are always developed by role models, by learning from others, by understanding how stratified the values and worth is in our society. It's always like that. There's nothing that we can't really remove that kind of hierarchical and status hierarchies. It's intrinsic to the human society and cultural evolution.
So if we still have time, I don't know what our deadline is. I would like to speak about another broader issue, which is so far, I think we mainly discussed about the consequences of openness and transparency in peer review for the academic or scholarly community. And I think there's this other interesting aspect about the kind of science-society interface, if you want to put it that way, of open peer review. And I was wondering, so your first study about the open reports, kind of, at least in my reading, comes to the conclusion that the negative effects that some of you assumed could happen, they didn't really realize. So it's basically, it works. And I was wondering how far, so this looks only at the kind of consequences within the academic community. I always had to think about the work of Stephen Hillgardner here and his book Science on Stage, where he shows how non-scientific actors, these, let's call them merchants of doubt, try to contest scientific findings. And he shows all the different strategies, how people contest, kind of publish reports. It's not peer reviewed in this case. And I'm wondering if we now start to make our open reports, let's say on more controversial academic fields like climate science, public, isn't it that we create so many different entry points for public contestations that the idea of basing political decisions on scientific facts becomes almost impossible? Yeah, it feels where it's already difficult right now.
Yeah, that's.
Sorry, Flamino, I'm just jumping in for a short second. I just wanted to remind you we're over time now. People sort of should look that they get to their next meetings. We have to sort of take a little bit care of all the people who are in there. So maybe if you find a way to keep the answer short, or we'll sort of say goodbye to the others and stay in the room for another 5 or 10 minutes, because there's also a long question from Victoria Momotay in the chat, which is a very nice one, but maybe that is something to answer written. So if you can sort of find a short way of answering, Flamino.
Yeah, and I would be short. So I agree, Maximilian, that it's the problem is that my understanding, so academic community needs boundaries. So we have blurred boundaries at all level, and this creates a lot of confusions. Like, for instance, in the public about during the pandemic, understanding that science is not a stone kind of things in which science tells you. No, there's no science tells you. Scientists are typically diverse and have different opinions, and this is exactly the point of science, no? To discipline a confrontation between different kind of opinions on the methodological ground. And unfortunately, yes, if this is the classic backfires effect about when there's no boundaries between a system like science and the public. There's need some boundaries, and now boundaries are blurred, and that's a problem of ambiguity. Yeah, and I will be here, so I would like to thank you all. I can stay still some 10 minutes to respond to your question if you stay here, or to write down some response to Victoria. Yeah, and so I'm here in case if you want to stay, if you can. Anyway, thank you very much. Very brilliant comments. I learned a lot this morning and this afternoon, and I would like to thank you for our two discussants, Fabian and Maximilian, and Martin, for the brilliant ideas, and everyone with these questions, very brilliant. And I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flamino, and thank you, Fabian and Maximilian, for asking questions. I think we can sort of formally close the session. And if you stick around for 5 minutes, Flamino, we might talk about the open questions for those who want. I just wanted to make sure that those who don't have additional time get a way of sort of closing the session the way we should, because this is sort of a teaching format. So goodbye to everyone, and those who want to stay around for another 5 minutes, please stay, and for the others, see you next week. Okay, so I don't know if you saw in the chat, there's a nice tool.
Yes, I'm reading this Victoria's.
Okay, so I'll let you read it yourself, and you can respond then.
Yeah, the very good question, Victoria, about yeah, there's a lot of discussions about metrics, how to value the contribution of an academic at different kind of level. You might also remember that academics also teach students, for instance. They have also the mission to try to educate the new generation. So I mean, that's, for instance, that's not only research but also training and teaching. And that is discussions about that more diverse set of metrics we have to try to judge, measure the contribution of a scientist, including the one that you are mentioning about the engagement with the public. It's important, because at some point, decision maker at for instance, in an institute can have the deliberate choice to maybe hire someone who has a lower H index than another one, but is more active, is more engaged in knowledge transfer to the public, because in that organization, in that institute, the engagement or the transfer of knowledge to the public is more important. So we need to create a situation in which decisions are based on multiple kind of drivers. Otherwise, it's really this crazy H index thing. It's really doing a lot of disaster to many of us. So I'm for instance, my university now, there's a strong focus about engagement with the public, and so now I'm also measuring not only for the publication or students' assessment at the end of the class, but I also assess it in terms of how many active events in engagement I'm doing. So this is another example. Unfortunately, red tape. But anyway, yeah, bureaucracy is always there. But anyway.
Fabian just rightly pointed to the fact that we probably should read out the question, because if we're saving the video and uploading it afterwards, people will not be able to see the chat and see what you are reacting to. So I just quickly will read out the question and then add something to it that I find interesting. So Victoria asked, I would like to ask two things. First, there's a strong focus on publications in peer-reviewed journals when it comes to academic careers. To my view, this disregards many other forms of publications, blogs, websites, podcasts, videos, and many more forms of scientific communication, and produce the citation bias. Shouldn't we somehow try to view such forms of publication equally and on eye level when it comes to, for example, recruitments? Or will there soon be platforms where even blog articles or podcasts are peer-reviewed? Second, there's a podcast which drafts situations where certain features, methods don't exist. So how would the world, or an academic world to start with, without peer review look like? The one thing I wanted to add is, you interpreted the first part as sort of a measurement valuation indicator question, but what if we think about this question as something that peer review is a form of certification? It's sort of a prize, a signal that something is worthy. It's not something that we count, but we could find ways to sort of assign value to things that are not publications, right? But peer review has sort of a special role in science. For things to be peer reviewed, this gives them a special status. So the question probably would be, should we find other ways of certifying other forms of output? What other certifications could there be other than this is peer reviewed? So
yeah, that's a very good question, Victoria. And yeah, well, you know that this sounds sometimes also a little bit paradoxical in the sense that we are just getting crazy to ensure that peer review is sustainable, so that we have enough workforce and capabilities to try to sustain an expansion of publication and journals and this kind of stuff. And someone can say, okay, if you have to peer review also podcasts and this kind of stuff, it's really does not contribute to the sustainability of the peer review in this kind of complex system. However, and it's true, because at the end of the day, what we do also when we discuss about podcast or pieces in the blog is that we assess them. You know, we discuss about them, we assess them. We at some point in the long run, very brilliant piece or scientific communication is recognized by the community and grows in a way, and others are probably not of sufficient quality to be noticed and so there's also this kind of attention that the community could be seen as a kind of it's not obviously peer review before getting visibility, but obviously it's peer review later. And yes, sure, in any case we need to have nurture different and explore also, as you say, Martin, we need to explore different way of certifying and the quality of knowledge goods that are around, independently from the type of format, scientific article, blogcast or blog pieces. Now the communication of the scholarly communication has changed a lot, so it's really something that it's so good question, Vittoria. I hope that I answer something. So Sebastian is asking another question. Being familiar with how software developers review their work, I wonder if at some point we can move to a model more like that one, where anyone can assess and review and improve research. The paper will be just a selling part of it. Yeah, this is very visionary, Sebastian. And yes, in principle, yes. However, there's a lot of evil is in the detail, in the sense that you know very well that in many cases, research is about collecting data for testing hypotheses, and this kind of data collection requires a lot of time, and is typically a competition, is a competitive advantage. So there's a lot of problems about sharing and using that kind of model that software developers use, because in most of the cases, the central point is that someone getting crazy to get fund to create an experiment to collect data. And then the team wants to have, or the rewards is to have the publication in time for priority claims, and so that is it's sometimes difficult. So this is an example about the fact that in principle we would love to have this kind of open science and open attitudes at all level of the scientific enterprise, but then for specific points throughout the process, this can create, this is incompatible with the actual rewards for priorities.
Okay, so we reached the 4 p.m. Mark of the day, and I think this is the moment where we should close it down for good, because people are also running away slowly but surely.
Yeah.
So again, thank you all very much. That was a very lively and interesting session, and have a very nice rest of this beautiful Monday here. I hope it's as
nice. It's beautiful also here. Yeah, it's sunny day. So thank you very much, guys. It's been very, as I told you, I learned a lot today. And Martin, if you want to chase me for the contributing to the development of the model, I would be very happy to collaborate.
I'm very happy also anytime. I mean, it didn't, or it was sort of short before to happen within the PERI situation, where I tried to come twice to conferences, and for sort of contingent reasons, it didn't work out. Yeah. But if this is the occasion, I would be very happy.
And this is open also to Maximilian and Fabian. Please chase me, and I'm very collaborative, and I need a little bit of new challenges for going on in this kind of ABN stuff. Otherwise, I'm a little bit stuck. So thank you very much, guys. A brilliant group of people.
Thank you very much.